Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first webinar of 2022 on foundations, the alternative to securing your assets in an offshore jurisdiction. We're so glad that you could join us, and we really hope that you find this webinar both beneficial and informative. In my experience as a relocation consultant, I've had many chats with clients and potential clients who are looking at moving to the island, and one of the things that we always tend to recommend is using a shareholding vehicle like a trust to secure one's assets. Funnily enough, I've found that the simple mention of a trust often seems to get a very negative reaction from many people. I'm not quite sure why this is. Perhaps it's the tax implications. However, when we mention foundations as an alternative, we find that people don't even know what a foundation is. They don't know of it as an alternative to using a trust, and they're not quite sure how to use it or when to use it or why to use it. So what we're trying to do in this webinar is rectify this situation and inform people on what foundations exactly are. But before we start with that, I'm just going to give a quick introduction on our panelists that we've got today, all of whom are experts in their respective fields. So first up, we've got Boris Pellegrin. Boris is the Managing Director of BTG Mauritius and is a qualified attorney of the High Court of South Africa. He has years of experience in corporate commercial work, international tax, financial services, and offshore structuring. Boris is going to be sharing quite a bit with us on the basics of foundations, as well as how Swiss foundations work. Next up, we'll have Hugo van Zyl from Werkkaner, a fully South African service to assist expats on their tax at home while they're away from home. Hugo is a qualified and highly experienced tax consultant, and he runs his own private tax practice from South Africa. He spends a large portion of his time assisting expats, also known as Werkkaners, hence the term Werkkaner, with all their tax and formal immigration needs. And many people refer to Hugo as Ask Hugo because he's the one who tends to answer all of the questions when it comes to foreign residents expat tax. After Hugo, we'll be hearing from Fia van der Spey. Fia is the founder of Trustees, which is a South African trust firm. Fia is an experienced chartered accountant and tax practitioner with many years of experience in the debt and equity finance, property development, risk management, and compliance sectors. Fia writes about trusts and estate planning in various national newspapers on a regular basis and has also published a book called Demystifying Trusts in South Africa. And last, but certainly not least, we will hear from Kersley Vinay. Kersley is the Business Development Director of BTG Mauritius and is a chartered accountant with a speciality in tax law. He has years of professional experience as an audit, tax, and corporate finance partner. And in addition to this, he has commercial experience as the CFO of a variety of listed and private companies, including exposure to structuring, planning, and commercial transactions. We'll hear from Kersley a little bit later as he unpacks and explains the Mauritian foundations. So on that note, welcome all of our panelists. We're so glad to have you here with us today. On that note, we're going to jump straight in. And I think, Boris, to start off, we could probably all do with a short comparison on the differences and similarities between trusts and foundations.
So just to put it a bit in perspective, and I'll just give a quick comparison on the legal structure, how it's established, and the operating structure between a foundation and a trust, just to give the listeners a bit of understanding. So the main difference, let's say on the legal structure between a foundation and a trust, is that a foundation is a separate legal entity where a trust isn't. So a foundation in its own name, it can contract and hold assets in its own name, it can sue and be sued in its own name, and it also holds a legal and beneficial title to the assets that it owns. So as compared to a trust, the trust's legal rights and obligations sit usually with the trustees rather than the trust itself, because the trust is not a legal entity, and the trustee therefore contracts in his or her own name on behalf of the trust. And then also on the legal ownership of the trust fund, that sits with the trustee again. The trustee has the beneficial ownership, the legal ownership over the assets, and the beneficiaries have a beneficial ownership over the assets. And then obviously the trustees would sue and be sued in their own name, as opposed to actions being taken against the trust fund itself. So that's the very big, let's say, large difference between a foundation and a trust and the legal structure. Looking at how it's also established, a foundation is normally registered with the registrar of companies in the various jurisdictions where you have foundations. And then the registration is conclusive evidence that the foundation has been incorporated. So it'll have a formal charter and articles which are registered with the registrar. Meanwhile, for a trust to be valid, just parties have to agree and demonstrate at the time of creation that was the intention for the trust to be created, that there was an asset that would be part of the trust fund, and that there's beneficiaries that were identified. That's all that's required. And then a trust doesn't need to be registered, and the existence of the trust therefore remains quite confidential. So it's not part of public record. And I think then lastly is just operating a structure. So there's foundations run by a council that runs its affairs. The council is almost like a board of directors. Meanwhile, the trust is run by the trustee, who's responsible for the decision-making and managing the trust fund. And then lastly, the duties. If we look at the duties on a foundation, the foundation council has, versus a trustee on a trust, on a foundation, the council has similar duties like a board of directors of a company. So the members of the council must act honestly, in good faith, and in view of the best interests of the foundation. They have to exercise care, diligence, and skill that reasonably prudent persons would exercise in comparable circumstances. So, and the foundation doesn't really have a fiduciary duty towards beneficiaries. Meanwhile, a trustee has far wider duties, and they have to look after the protection of the beneficiaries and also act in accordance with what the trust deed says. And they have to act with due diligence that a prudent person, to the best of that trustee's ability, would act in, and with the necessary skill, and observe the utmost good faith. So there's it's quite a more serious yardstick than, let's say, a foundation council would have to handle. Then lastly, I'll just touch on the tax. I mean, in some jurisdictions, both a trust and a foundation are almost treated the same. They're usually sometimes treated as exempt entities, not liable to taxation. So there's not a major difference between the two as far as taxation is concerned.
Sure. So some real fundamental differences there between the two, and yet used in I suppose, in a similar way. So how exactly would one know when to use a foundation, or how to use a foundation?
So the basic litmus test for using a foundation is as a form of vehicle for asset protection, for succession planning, for wealth preservation. So wealthy families that want to preserve their assets and grow their assets in, let's say, in a neutral tax environment, would usually use a foundation. Families that want an element of control, if you recall, I mentioned that a council usually manages the foundation like a board of directors. So family members could join the council and participate in the decision-making process with the foundation, where that's not really possible with a trust. In certain instances, foundations work better than a company, where, for example, you'd have a company that you'd want to trade or do services in. A foundation can also do that because it is a legal entity. But let's say the core use of a foundation is usually for succession planning and asset protection.
Thank you very much for that answer. So the idea of diasporic families spread out over multiple jurisdictions is becoming more and more common. I think in my role as a relocation specialist, I do deal with a lot of diasporic families. But Hugo, this is really your forte. In your dealing with these type of families, what advice or guidance can you provide, and how can foundations be particularly beneficial for these type of families?
Thank you, Candice. And when listening to Boris, one actually finds there's far more pointers as to why trust not always the solution. But we love trust in South Africa, and I'm one of those who believe, despite all the anti-avoidance rules and tax rules, that there's still a place for trusts. But what we must be aware of is that a trust, a South African trust, or what we know as an offshore trust in a low tax jurisdiction, is an absolute no-no when you're going to immigrate to different countries where a South African trust or an English common law trust is not normally accepted. If we think of people going to Portugal, Spain, they just don't understand a South African trust. They have signed, and Fia can elaborate on that, the Den Hague Convention to say they acknowledge trust, but they do not understand it. Furthermore, if we, for example, look at the US, the distribution from a trust that was created before you arrived is really problematic because of the throwback tax. So my advice to answer your question is that the first question I ask is, why was the trust created? Do you still need it? Could we not then rather use a foundation instead of a trust? Because in most jurisdictions, the foundation will, for their purposes, then quack as a company and not as a trust. The other part that is very, very important is, I'm coming to, and you probably have that cases as well, Candace, where we find South Africans are so diasporic that you have one child in the US, one child in England, one child in Australia. And each one of them have a different set of rules for what they call offshore trusts. And we must now remember that a South African trust is an offshore trust. And maybe the common ground is then to use a foundation that will quack as a company in their jurisdictions.
Thanks, Hugo. Very, very interesting. And I think that really that is the way that it's going these days, with just families spread out over the globe, particularly South African families. But I think people from all over tend to, their children just tend to move off and spread out as opposed to staying in their country of origin. Sophia, you've obviously, as Hugo mentioned, you've got lots of experience in the trust department, primarily dealing with South Africans. Can you give us the South African perspective on foundations?
Yes, as Hugo say, a lot of South Africans have had their foreign trusts for a long time. So foundations is really new to them. And us South Africans are very reactive when it comes to estate planning, and tax is often the driver. So I think when we move away from that, it's much easier to then understand better what proactive planning we can do and what options are available. As Hugo said, the diasporic families cause a unique problem because, we may have, children and their descendants sitting in different jurisdictions. So a traditional trust may not be the way to go. And then in South Africa specifically, we have a flight of capital, for those people who may not want to stay in South Africa. So we need to look at what structures are available internationally. So in our ever-changing landscape of personal tax and compliance, and with every family having unique dynamics and objectives, the structures and vehicles available to us, need and are also evolving. So, and I think although a lot of people don't understand foundations, I think it really becomes an important tool that people can use in their estate planning. And then obviously all the increases in complexity in taxation and the reporting requirement, one also needs to consider. And I think it's very important when you consider a foundation is to really understand, the complexities around cost and reporting, around those. Yeah, as I said, in South Africa, we're traditionally very familiar with trusts, and the foundation is certainly an attractive alternative to trusts for wealthy individuals. And, just to give some perspective in South Africa and, why we have this flight of capital and for people looking elsewhere is our personal income taxes contribute over 39%, to tax revenues. So people are looking at alternatives, and it's not just because, saving taxes also, pushing you away from a country where we are, taxed quite heavily. And because we have tax brackets, the top 3 tax brackets represent 1/3 of the total income tax. So, the wealthy individuals are really taxed heavily, and they are looking at alternatives from that perspective. And yeah, I think, when we just look at the way, SARS is upskilling, and, in the recent comments made in the National Treasury in their budget review document, they spoke about how they're investing heavily in upskilling staff. They recruited additional staff. They spent 430 million Rand in kind of modernizing infrastructure. So, I think the days are over to think you're going to have international structures and SARS won't know about about them. And I think it's very important to get correct advice. And as I say, we typically tend to be reactive. And I think, it's very important to speak to professionals who can assist you, especially when it comes to a foundation, which is not very well known in South Africa. So yeah, I think coming back to foundations, although they're relatively new and certainly to common law jurisdictions, there are fewer of them compared to trusts, but I really think they're going to have increased use and certainly a vehicle to consider for our succession planning and even philanthropy.
Thanks, Fia. That's very, very interesting. And I think, as you say, in this case, knowledge really is power. The more you know and the more you understand, the better your decision-making can be. And that's where it's very important to speak to somebody who's in the know, somebody who is a professional and can guide you. So thank you very much. I think that background has helped us to all understand just a little bit more about foundations. Kersley, perhaps you can start us off with an explanation of the Mauritian Foundation.
Thanks, Candice. Yes, absolutely. It's very clear in Mauritius that the foundation is a sound juristic person. It's governed by the Foundations Act of 2012. Foundations are also registered with the Registrar of Foundations, which sits inside of the Registrar of Companies, and it's evidenced by a certificate of registration. So it's the very act of registering your foundation that creates a separate legal person, so separate to the founder. The document that initiates the foundation is known as a foundation charter. In the charter, you deal with the purpose, the objects of the foundation. You detail who the council members are, the beneficiaries, and it generally deals with the administration and management of the foundation. Then there's normally an endowment of assets into the foundation, either by the founder, or if it's in terms of a will, it'll come from the executor. So the object or purpose can be very wide in Mauritius, provided it does not contravene any of the laws of Mauritius. Foundations in Mauritius, very interestingly, can engage in trade and commerce. So we have certain clients that set up a foundation and they trade. Normally, we're looking at low levels of trading, and we recommend if someone's into high levels of trading that they consider probably a global business license company. Then, Candice, just to touch basically on the tax residency, if the central management and control of the foundation is outside of Mauritius, then it will not be tax resident, and that foundation will only be taxed on the local income sourced in Mauritius. If a tax residence, if the CMC, the control, central management and control, is inside Mauritius, the foundation will be tax resident and will be taxed on worldwide income. So you'll find, Candice, most of our clients are, from South Africa or Africa, and they tend to be non-resident in Mauritius. When it comes to appointing council members in Mauritius, you need to have at least one council member who is ordinarily resident in Mauritius. The foundation is also required to appoint a qualified secretary, and in Mauritius, a management company will be the secretary. And a management company is registered with and governed by the Financial Services Commission of Mauritius. The foundation also needs to establish a registered office in Mauritius as well. If we come to record keeping, all the records, including the accounting records, contracts, any documentation needs to be kept and maintained at the registered office of the foundation. And when it comes to access to information, the beneficiaries have rights of access to that information going through the company, the foundation secretary. When it comes to third-party access, they can only access any information with the permission of the foundation secretary. So confidentiality is basically enshrined. The founder of a foundation, it can be a beneficiary and does not necessarily have to be a resident in Mauritius. And then, Candice, just the last point I need to make is that when you establish the name of the foundation, it needs to end with foundation. So no other form or reference to association or company or limited. It has to be foundation. So it could be the Candice Thompson Foundation, the Blue Ocean Foundation. So that's also stipulated in the Foundations Act. Thank you. That's quite a short summary there.
Thanks very much, Kersley. That's fantastic. A really great, just like you say, summary of it all. And I must admit, I kind of like the idea of a Candace Thompson Foundation. Makes me sound very important. Very, very helpful. Thanks for that. So Boris, perhaps you can just give us, kind of like Kersley's done, just give us a little bit of a breakdown on Swiss foundations, because at BCG, we do offer both Mauritian and Swiss foundations. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about Swiss foundations.
Yes, so foundations in Switzerland are legally recognized. They have a long history of case law and jurisprudence on foundations. The Civil Code, which is the official statutes of Switzerland, permits the establishment of what we call family maintenance foundations. There's other foundations as well. You also have holding foundations, you have business foundations, you have charitable foundations as well in Switzerland. Where it does differ a little bit from, let's say, the common law jurisdictions like Mauritius, is the family type of foundations. We call them maintenance foundations. They have to meet a specific purpose of meeting costs of education, equipping a family member or supporting family members, or similar purposes. So it's very specific over there. What is prohibited is normally having a foundation that you use for wealth accumulation. So like we would in Mauritius, use that for wealth accumulation. Funny enough, in Switzerland, that's prohibited. They rather have foundations for family reasons to meet costs of education and equipping and supporting. So where family members need support and they need maintenance, that's where the foundations normally come into play. So it's a little bit more limited in scope than you'd have with, let's say, a Mauritian foundation. Let me move on to the business or holding foundations. So these are also quite, they special form type of foundations in Switzerland, developed more by practice and not explicitly regulated by the law, by the Civil Code in Switzerland. Business foundations basically directly operate a commercial enterprise. So you'll find these types of foundations often appearing as holding hospitals, or care homes or schools or museums or theaters. So they're different. The difference here from ordinary, let's say, family foundation lies with their commercial activity. So they would own specific public benefit organizations in that instance. A holding foundation, there's also specific foundation, not explicitly regulated by law, but these types of foundations can hold equity in an operating company. So specifically with the purpose of owning the shares in that company. But again, that foundation can't be used for the benefit of a family who's got a family company or business to accumulate funds for them, unless it's to support the family members. That's a little bit limited in scope, sometimes more used for employee benefits and things like that. So in Switzerland, although well recognized, a lot of jurisprudence, the typical wealth preservation, wealth accumulation foundation is not really used because of this prohibition against that, and it's more focused towards family maintenance. And what a lot of the Swiss, let's say, regulated trust and corporate services providers, they usually then use a foundation, funny enough, outside of Switzerland, the Liechtenstein Foundation, where clients want wealth preservation and wealth accumulation, and then they manage that in Switzerland. So the pure common law foundation, not really well used and well received in Switzerland. But there are moves to change that more recently, because Swiss trustees now must be licensed on the trustee side. There are some commentators that feel that the family maintenance foundations must catch up in terms of the common law foundations a little bit more, and that they should be allowed in future, but at this point in time they're not. So purely if a client is looking to look after family members, set them up in business, let's say there's children who are incapacitated, then yes, you'd look at a Swiss type of family foundation, but not in the other instance.
So the first FAQ that we've got is on charities and NGOs. I think we're all quite familiar with things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Are foundations only for charities and NGOs, or can anybody really have a foundation?
So Candace, if I can jump in from my side, yes, from a South African perspective, anyone can have that foundation. It can be anywhere in the world, provided you've complied with the South African exchange control rules. So you must properly fund it with legitimate funds. Okay, so yes, it has a role for NGOs and so on, but yeah, foundations, as we are discussing today, is in fact, I would rather call it either passive holding vehicle, or as Kersley mentioned earlier, it can trade. And I know we're going to deal with that trading thing a little bit later. And so the very important part is that if you do an NGO, you must just make sure that it will be in South Africa considered an NGO. So strangely enough, our current law does not provide for an NGO to be a foreign entity. So if it's a foreign entity, it literally needs to come and register a branch or presence in South Africa.
Thanks, Hugo. Very, very interesting. So then can we also, sort of one of the other questions that we tend to get is, can we have shareholding within a foundation? I know, Kersley, you've mentioned that they often tend to act like they are companies, but can you have shareholding within a foundation?
Again is no. So as was previously explained, that your foundation is a hybrid of a company and a trust. So in a foundation, you don't hold shares as you would in a private company in South Africa, but where you do benefit from the foundation is being nominated as a beneficiary. So one doesn't hold shares in the foundation, but they get nominated as a beneficiary, and that's where they'll enjoy the fruits and capital of the foundation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kersley. So then what types of assets can people actually put into a foundation if they can't put shares into it?
No, Candace, the foundation itself can own shares in underlying companies, but the founder or beneficiaries do not in turn own shares in the foundation. But just to unpack that question a bit further, yeah, it can own all sorts of assets. I don't think there's many restrictions. Particularly in Mauritius, you got to look at, does it contravene any of the laws in Mauritius? So you don't want to hold an asset that in any way, shape or form contravenes the laws. So an example of that is cannabis is forbidden or legal in Mauritius, and therefore the foundation would be forbidden for acquiring or investing in an underlying company that is trading in cannabis, for instance.
Can I add to that a question, Kersley, and Fia, maybe you can also add to that from a South African perspective. I get a lot of questions from South Africans to then not dissolve the South African trust, but to create a foundation for, say, the American child, and then amend the trust deed, assuming the trust deed can be amended, to then nominate that foundation as a beneficiary. So first of all, Kersley, to you, can a Mauritian foundation be a beneficiary of a non-Mauritian trust? And then Fia, maybe from your side, from a South African legal perspective, I know the exchange control is a bit more complex, but from a legal perspective, can the beneficiary be a foundation outside South Africa?
Yeah. So you go from the Mauritius side, yes, a foundation can be nominated as a beneficiary of a trust.
Yes, and from a South African perspective, I think you would have to go back to your constitutive document, which is your trust deed, and ensure that you can alter beneficiaries, and maybe just extend the class of beneficiaries to kind of include others, such as a foundation. So I think your starting point would be your trust deed, and understand whether changes are necessary there before you can even nominate a foundation.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So Kersley, you have mentioned very briefly that a person can trade or do basic trading in a foundation. That is obviously one of the questions we get often asked, is whether I can trade in a foundation. What are the limitations with regards to that?
So Candace, from a Mauritian point of view, you can definitely trade in a foundation. We manage quite a few clients that trade through that foundation and successfully. The only limitation, once again, is to not be doing or trading anything in contravention of the laws of Mauritius. So there's no prohibition on the types of businesses that you can run through a foundation, as opposed to a global business license company.
Candice, if I can comment there just also. So yes, they can, even from a South African perspective, but Anfia is welcome to comment again. But I see the foundations becoming the top passive holding entity, replacing a trust. And I know we have trading trusts as well, but I'm one of those old school advisors that says the top passive holding vehicle should have no risk. So I do not like a passive holding vehicle trading. So if a client comes to me and he wants to trade, I say, push it down to a company below and rather keep that vehicle passive. It's also very complex. If you think of trading through a foundation, then in certain jurisdictions, like in the UAE, you have to have a substantive presence there, okay, where they, at this stage, exempt passive holding vehicles in entities from, they don't need an office, they just need to have their meetings in that jurisdiction. Chris, I don't know if you have indication, is that the same in the Mauritian tax law?
Yes, Mauritius. So Hugo, in Mauritius, we got the same thinking as yourself. We prefer to keep the risk below in a trading company. There's one or two clients who've chosen to trade in the foundation purely to save costs. But we've made them aware of the risk. But we prefer the structure of having any trading in an underlying subsidiary company.
Yeah, I think the value of a foundation as a estate planning vehicle and a wealth protection vehicle is really underestimated and probably not well known by people. So, yeah, I think there's education required there in terms of, you know, it's almost like a trust, but it just does not behave like a trust. So, fully agree with you guys in terms of protect your wealth there and, you know, take the risk elsewhere.
That makes perfect sense. So it's kind of like those Russian dolls where you've got one thing nested within another. In a very simplistic way of explaining it. That's how my mind works. So one of the other FAQs that we often get is, what are the regulations on a foundation compared to that of a trust?
Right, so I mean, your main, you can call it regulations, it's the main act or main statutory provisions are usually found in the Foundations Act. And then you also have the Trusts Act, and you'll find in a lot of the jurisdictions like Mauritius, and I'll call them the common law jurisdictions, Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, etc. You'll find similar acts. And the acts just prescribe in general how the foundation has to be formed, how it's operated, and how it must be dissolved. And it leaves a lot of, let's say, the internal workings of the foundation over to the founder and the council, and sometimes the beneficiaries to agree on, and the parties would agree on a foundation charter, which is your general your general main provisions on how who are the parties around the foundation, and you know, how it operates. And then the day-to-day, let's say, more nitty-gritty regulation is found in the articles of the foundation. And the articles can be very specific, they can be very broad, but that would give you the internal workings of the council of the foundation, when to hold meetings, how meetings are held, how decisions are taken, how distributions are done, etc. On the trust side, it's just the trust deed, which kind of stipulates you know, what the trustees must take into account, what's the purpose of the trust, who are the beneficiaries of the trust, and it will deal with the internal regulation on decision making for the trustee. So you'll have these two overarching acts, the Foundation Act, and then on the foundation side, it's charter and articles that will rule and regulate the foundation. On the trust side, it will be the Trusts Act and the trust deed that will then rule and regulate how the trust operates.
And then last question that is often asked, and we have mentioned South Africa quite a bit in this webinar already, but how does SARS look at foundations?
So Candice, thank you. It's quite interesting. In our current Income Tax Act, a foundation is not defined, okay? But if you look at the definition of a trust, it means any trust fund consisting of cash or other assets which are administered and controlled by a person, your council or your board, acting in a fiduciary capacity, where such person is appointed under a deed or trust or arrangement or under the will of a deceased person. So at the moment, SARS treats the foundation as a trust fund. Okay, therefore it's taxed as a trust. Okay, so interestingly, then it then quacks the distribution is then taxed in your name, and it's not a foreign dividend. So very important for most people who wants a participation exemption, a foreign dividend exemption, then don't use the foundation. Then it may not be suitable. But if you're quite happy to pay the tax on the distributions to you as a trust distribution, then a foundation is very nice, because in another country, and I'm just going to use one example, in Netherlands, for example, foundations are on their company register. So the Netherlands, for example, treats a distribution from a trust, a foundation, as a dividend. Okay, and you are deemed to then receive a dividend, although you're not a shareholder, and they tax it as a dividend. But they, unlike South Africa, don't differentiate in tax rates between dividend and normal income streams. So that's not particularly important to them. So for example, if you are using a foundation in Mauritius and it distributes to you, I would suggest that you follow the trust rules and you'd then be taxed on that. And if you had a participatory right or expectation in the past, then the accrued income distributed in this year will then be taxed in your name as well. So you can't just be taxed on the current distributions. You must look at the source of the fund. So normal trust rules apply. Okay. And also very, very important is that I think Kersley did mention that you mentioned this word CMC, we would say effective management in South Africa. So, oh, come on. Effective management in South Africa is very, very important. Sorry about that, apologies. It's very important because that effective management must be outside of South Africa to be taxed as an offshore trust. If that effective management is in South Africa, then we have normal South African local tax rules dealing with trusts. Fia, is that your experience as well? Oh, I just wanted to add in the special VDP, special voluntary disclosure process, when we cleaned up foreign trusts that were undeclared to South Africa at the time, they in that definition, they specifically included, oh, apologies, I thought I switched it off. My sincere apologies. And that definition, I'm just going to recap that. In the special VDP law of 2015, dealing with the VDPs of 2016, they specifically included foundations in the definition of a trust. But in the Income Tax Act, it's a little bit silent, but the interpretation is it is a trust.
Yeah. And I think that's what's so interesting is that SARS has opted for this to be considered as trusts for tax purposes, whereas, you know, when you look at it, it's got separate legal personality, and that's one of the big differences, you know, between companies, between foundations and trusts, is the legal personality. So yeah, it's very interesting that, you know, this is the way SARS treats foundations rather as trusts, rather than, you know, a separate legal personality or entity.
Very, very interesting. Thanks very much. That makes perfect sense, actually. So thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, panelists, for your answers and the insights that you've shared with us today. For our audience, we will be adding the contact details of our panelists in our comment section. So if you'd like to schedule a meeting for more specialized advice or information on how to set up a foundation, please feel free to drop them a mail. We really hope that you found this webinar both insightful and helpful, and that when it comes to looking at securing your assets offshore in future, that you will potentially consider foundations as a viable option. Have a great day, and thank you for joining us for this 2022 webinar.